Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, good to see you again, and thank you for all you're doing. And before I get to my questions regarding regulatory review, I want to just share with you a little bit of good news. We keep hearing all this bad news, but 2 years ago, when I went home one weekend, it was at several events, a gentleman came up to me and he shared with me a story that he did not feel like he could continue on running their small manufacturing business that had been in their family for decades. In fact, he told me it was so difficult to do business between regulation, lack of access to capital, customers. It wasn't just him, but even his customers putting pressure on him because of their costs going up. He said, after decades of running this small business, I'm going to retire and I'm going to shut this business down. And my children don't even want to be in the business because it's so difficult to do business. This weekend, I ran into that same gentleman who came up to me with a big smile on his face. He said, I just want to tell you, my accountant came to me last week and said, next year, because of the tax reform bill, you are going to save $100,000 in this business. He said, no longer am I shutting it down. I'm trying to figure out the best way to expand the business right now. So that is a true Main Street story of what we've done.
Thank you. We like those stories.
Oh, I do too. And hey, I'll tell you, it's a whole lot better to go home and hear thank you. Thank you for what you've done, and we're hearing it all over. I wanted to discuss an issue that you raised in the Treasury report on banks and credit unions. You discussed the importance of retrospective reviews of agencies' regulations, which many in this room on a bipartisan basis believe we should have regular reviews of regulations, especially those that are antiquated, outdated, or irrelevant. And in the report, you also noted that before Dodd-Frank, the banking agencies themselves were responsible for implementing consumer financial protection laws, so these regulations were included in reviews under Economic Growth and Regulatory Paperwork Act. However, when Dodd-Frank created the CFPB, consumer regulations were no longer subject to these reviews. Now, just in the last few weeks, we passed a bill out of this committee on a bipartisan basis that I authored that would actually include CFPB in the Agrippa review process. And my question is, can you explain or further explain why it's important for these regulatory agencies to review their rules periodically?
Again, I think it's very important. I think that rules and regulations are very important, but on the other hand, they need to be constantly looked at as markets change, and make sure that we don't over-regulate to the extent we can't have growth.
So being that the changes in Dodd-Frank basically exempted CFPB from reviewing their own regulations, you support the idea of returning CFPB just to do the basic reviews?
I do completely. I'm not sure why they were exempted, so I agree with the change.
And as I said, we've got strong bipartisan support for this bill, so I hope that we'll see that when it comes to the floor. And we changed a little bit of the time frame. Instead of 10 years to 7 years, I think, as things change, that will help American consumers by having more frequent reviews. The other area that's very important to me is cybersecurity. That's been brought up a few times. I worked in the cybersecurity arena before coming to Congress. I had an IT services company for many years, and I also worked in the intelligence community back in the military, which in both instances we were tasked with protecting data. And one of the principles we worked off of is you don't have to protect what you don't have. What that means is if you don't need information, don't keep the information. Otherwise, you become a risk. And from what I've seen is that quite often the federal government, through its regulatory agencies, puts onerous requirements on businesses to not only keep data that they normally would not keep or they don't need to keep, but also report it to the federal government, which we have seen as our own federal government is by far a higher security risk than a lot of businesses. Do you agree with those principles and ideas that we should have a stringent review on what data we're requiring businesses not only to keep but to report?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we'll yield the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman for